Napoleon Bonaparte. Let's start this video with an important fact. My man was not short. I repeat, Napoleon was not short. Napoleon was 5'6", which is exactly the height of this guy. For his era, Napoleon's height was perfectly average, if not slightly above average, and this whole Napoleon is short with a big head and small hands thing was just genius propaganda by his enemies to counteract the fear that Napoleon inspired all across Europe. If you're wondering how much fear that was, later writers went on to call Napoleon Bonaparte the god of war. Enough said. But I still have like things to say for like over 30 minutes, so not enough said. Please keep watching. All of Europe feared Napoleon because Napoleon clapped everybody's cheeks, and not only once neither, man. This guy won the title, the rematch, and the rematch is rematch, and the rematch is rematch. You get the point. Bonaparte was the undisputed pound for pound boss of Europe and made all the other kings his sons. So let's do a full biography on Papa Napoleon. The god of war was literally born into war. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on August 15, 1769 in Corsica, which had just been taken over by the French. Napoleon has 7 siblings, and his anime anti-hero arc really only starts once he enrolled at the Royal Military School of Brienne-le-Château at age 9. If you watched any shonen anime ever, you've seen this before. Kid enrolls in fancy school, gets bullied because he's broke and talks weird, so he becomes a loner who is obsessed with studying conquerors and war tactics, which is weird, so he gets bullied even more because they're like, what are you studying, nerd? But he takes the beating knowing he will one day dominate them all. It's really a bulletproof blueprint for making a great hero or villain, but don't try it in real life because it's also a bulletproof blueprint for severe depression. Instead of suicide thoughts though, Napoleon took a page out of Naruto's book and had dreams of one day being in charge. But reality check, bro. Real life is not an anime, and France at the time was ruled by the rich. Dreams might get you far in fiction, but in real life it's not like some random event will suddenly completely shake up the status quo, which allows a lowborn from outside of France to rise in power purely based on the merit of his bravery and talent. Except that's exactly literally what happened. The French Revolution happened. The French were tired of being ruled by the monarchs and their favoritism for the nobles. They were pissed for many complex reasons, but to put it simply and into something we can all relate to, the rich didn't have to pay taxes. Only the poor did. That meant that when French kings, the inbred Louis kings, conveniently numbered so you know their level of inbreeding, like Louis XIV, built Versailles, a place with 700 rooms that cost the equivalent of $2 billion today, the poor had to pay for it. So the poor decided that they'd rather chop the king's head off, and in 1793, 4 years into the revolution, the 16th inbred Louis lived up to his nickname Louis le Dernier, Louis the Last, because he got his head chopped off. And his wife Marie Antoinette got her head chopped off too later in the year. Finally, the evil, oppressive rule of the monarchy was over, and France was a republic that belonged to the people. Finally, France could enter an era of absolute chaos. Unprecedented chaos, madness, death, and misery. All of that bad stuff followed. Because, bro, the revolutionaries were like the dog chasing the car.
I wouldn't know what to do with one if I caught it.
They had no idea what to do with France now that they got their hands on it. Sure, they labeled it La Première République, but other than that, their only plan was to kill everybody that even entertained the idea of bringing the monarchy back and spoke up against this new republic. The former revolutionaries became the new government of the republic in an era that has since been called the Reign of Terror, highlighted by 40,000 people who were beheaded or died in prison just in the span of a year. After the monarchy was abolished, France was in chaos. But Napoleon knew
Chaos is a ladder.
it's not that Napoleon was a revolutionary or necessarily cared about France or the people all that much. Napoleon cared only about Napoleon. having power. And this whole down with the elites thing that France had going on really worked in his favor. So he embraced the new French Republic, kissed some Republican ass, and by 1793, at age 23, Napoleon was made an artillery captain, aka the new dog for the new government to hunt down the remaining royalists, those who wanted the old Louis monarchy back. Now, quick fact check here, because this is getting kind of complicated. We have the monarchy of inbred numbered Louis, who ruled France for centuries, right? We have the revolution, who ended the monarchy and turned France into a republic, so they were the new republican government. And so the defeated monarchy supporters were now royalist rebels who were hunted down. That's all within France. You with me? All of this was a problem for the rest of Europe, the other European countries, because they all were monarchies where the rich are living their best life by exploiting the poor. Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia were the main guys who were not down with France going through their rebellious phase. They didn't want none of this French Revolution smoke. They didn't need uprisings all over Europe to undermine their privileged rule. So the monarchs took issue and became a good old monarch fraternity against France. Just remember this so you know the fronts in and outside of France, all right? The bond between monarchs and general monarchy fanboys was in fact so strong that French royalists supported the British monarchy trying to invade France to reinstate the French monarchy, yeah? And this is where we come back to the newly minted Captain Napoleon, who was given the task to clap some royalist cheeks. In the harbor town of Toulon, French royalists had opened the ports for the British. That was the problem. Napoleon's cheek-clapping mission was the solution. Mind you, at this point, Napoleon was an absolute virgin in the art of clapping cheeks, so I'd like to think my guy was kind of nervous when him and his troops fought the British and the French royalists at the harbors of Toulon. But Napoleon popped his cherry successfully. All cheeks were clapped thoroughly. 10 British ships were burned, the rest of the British retreated, and the Republican government knew exactly what to do with the French royalist traitors. Chop chop. But Napoleon didn't just win that battle. No, he won with crappy troops that he whipped into shape. He won with crappy troops that he whipped into shape and led into battle himself. He won after he had his horse shot dead under him after bayonets slashed him. Napoleon still successfully clapped cheeks against all odds. So now, Napoleon was the go-to clapper for whenever royalists were acting up. And it just so happened that royalists were kind of planning a new coup d'etat. That's fancy French for saying they wanted to overthrow the new government, the new republic that had just been formed. They wanted another numerically designated inbred Louis. So the Republic sent Supreme Clapper Bonaparte to stop all that uprising nonsense, and Napoleon whooped all the royalists in France and thus stopped the civil war that was about to escalate. And as a reward, Napoleon Bonaparte was made commander of the Army of the Interior in 1796 at just 27 years young, a title that would set up a new assignment: clap cheeks internationally. Italy was calling. So while all this trouble was going on within France, they also had trouble at their borders, because I repeat, the other monarchies in Europe really disliked the whole beheading kings and queens thing France had going on and wanted to set an example that this type of stuff does not fly. So the French threw the chopped off heads around to show that this type of stuff does indeed fly. Oh, that was a bad joke. The rest of Europe did not recognize France in any way, and les enfants de la patrie came under fire from all borders. And one of those borders was Italy, where the Austrians had set up shop and fought the French for years. A real slow jam battle that the French were losing, and after years their army was malnourished, not motivated, and just a bunch of scrubs, really. So when this new 27-year-old commander, Napoleon, arrived at the scene talking about clapping Austrian cheeks to some Italian tunes, the military veterans laughed at him like, what's he gonna change after years of... So Napoleon won the war in 2 weeks. Bruh, I'm telling you, this guy was on some real Braveheart thing when it came to motivating and leading troops. Man was all like,
Immortality! Take it! It's yours!
just so you understand, Napoleon winning with this army was like LeBron dragging the crappy Cleveland roster to a championship. The French won thanks to the pure genius of Napoleon and his bravery of actually joining them at the front lines. Napoleon outmaneuvered the Austrians at every turn with speed and splitting the enemy army up into smaller fractions by cutting off supply lines, forcing them into battles where his cavalry and his soldiers just blitzed them. So after arriving on the scene and within 2 weeks changing a year-long losing war campaign into a winning campaign, there was a snowball effect, and Napoleon continued to steamroll and use his genius maneuvers and high-paced warfare to take more territory from the European monarchies who were trying to bully France: Italy, Austria, and North Africa. Yeah, I know North Africa must be like,
What do you say fuck me for?
I know they're not European, but the reason Napoleon campaigned through North Africa was because France was locked in a stalemate with the British forces elsewhere. And the British had some things going on in Egypt, so Monsieur Bonaparte visiting Egypt was an attempt to tip the war in France's favor. Also, Napoleon was quickly rising in popularity, and when he won those battles all over Europe, he himself signed treaties with the losers and carved up the lands. He had no business doing that. That's like LeBron being the coach and le GM, and the actual head coach and GM feeling like an idiot. That was not Napoleon's role. So Egypt was a good way for the French government to keep Napoleon at arm's length and to stop him from getting too many MVP and Coach of the Year votes. You get me? But Napoleon used Egypt to his advantage. For him, it was a way to follow in the footsteps of his idols, Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, by literally following in their footsteps, because they used to be in Egypt too. That was kind of poorly phrased. I think we should... Oh, he's sleeping. I was going to say, should we cut that? But he's sleeping. He's so cute. In 1798, Napoleon traveled to Egypt with a bunch of scholars and set up a science institute, and then he sent back a bunch of publications to France about how he's doing these amazing things in Egypt and discovering all this cool and ancient stuff, and how he's setting up French interests. He even had himself painted touching plague victims in Egypt, like he's healing them like some kind of god, which of course he thought he was. And all of that was a bluff, because on the military side of things, it wasn't going well for Napoleon in Egypt. The British were not happy with this unscheduled visit and destroyed his fleet at the harbor. And on land, the British teamed up with the Ottomans and gave Napoleon's troops hell. It got so bad that Napoleon wanted out of Egypt. Egypt was turning into a waste of time for him, and he was losing his precious momentum. He wanted to return to France to use his conquering momentum, so he abandoned his troops and his post in Egypt and returned home, where thanks to his genius propaganda, Egypt was a roaring success for Napoleon, because that's all the people back home in France heard and cared about. So when he returned to Paris, people were like, and Napoleon was like,
I'm him!
only to find out that his wife had cheated on him while he was gone. Look, here's a guy who basically ascended to godlike status in his country and literally made his country bigger, literally, and his wife still cheats on him. It just goes to show that it's not the size of your country that matters. You get me? Also, his wife, Josephine, was kind of known to belong to the streets, but Napoleon had married her because she was hot and she had status. Fair enough. And it's not like he wasn't cheating on her too, but still, Napoleon went through a sad mixtape phase, wrote a sad letter about her cheating that the British then intercepted and published to embarrass him and push their propaganda of Napoleon being the short, big-headed, soft, bumbling fool. But for now, Napoleon had to climb the ladder of chaos in France, which was in absolute chaos, divided and on the brink of civil war. Years later, life without the monarch still wasn't what it was advertised to be. Way too many heads were rolling, people were starving, there was thieving, there was poverty, there was chaos, no structure, no security. It was bad. Enter Napoleon Bonaparte, fresh off of conquering land and some epic Egypt propaganda, even though that was a failure. The people loved him. He was the people's champ, loved by the millions and millions. So Napoleon had an idea. Hey, salut, bonjour, ça va, ça va, ça va. I have an idea. Let's overthrow the government and do a new government headed by 3 consuls. Maybe I should be one of them. Just one of 3. Not like I'm ruling, just un, deux, trois, one of 3. But maybe I should be the first of the 3 consuls. There's 3, but I'm first. All consuls are equals, of course, but I'm more equal. Égalité. So basically, Napoleon hijacked a coup d'etat that was already in the works before he even returned to France. He was originally just meant to be the military guy used for his popularity to help the boring nerd politicians who actually came up with the coup d'etat take control. But Napoleon was so popular that he just pushed the boring nerd politicians into irrelevance. And in 1799, he became the first consul of what in theory was a consulate of 3 people ruling France, but in reality, it was just Napoleon. So with Napoleon in charge, a lot of things changed. He fixed the ruined economy by establishing the Bank of France. He made secondary education free, which further undermined the power of the elites, and he promoted people based on merit, no matter their status. Napoleon also turned the messy laws that were all over the place and no one cared about into the Code Napoleon, a civil code. And now all men were equal before the law, which finally brought safety and stability back to France. All in all, Napoleon brought a level of conservative leadership back, and he also brought back slavery to the French colonies and decided that women don't really need any of those civil rights. They're better off being the property of men. I'm not kidding, that's actually true. He really set them back. Evil tongues say he was salty because his wife cheated on him. We'll never really know. So this is France right now, right? Solid for the Frenchmen, not so much for the slaves and the women. But Napoleon was like, good enough, and rode off again, back to fight his favorite country to beat up on, Austria. The second Napoleon went back to France to set women back for decades, the monarch fraternity of Europe helped Austria take back all the land Napoleon had conquered. And I repeat that because it's important. They took it back immediately after he left. This was a theme throughout Napoleon's reign. He couldn't be everywhere at once, and everywhere Napoleon was, he was victorious. But everywhere he wasn't, well, he wasn't. The Austrians got all confident again all of a sudden and forgot about their sore cheeks that had Napoleon slapped all over them. And Napoleon knew he had to send them a little reminder. So he rallied his troops. Guys, let's do a road trip. Alps. How about that, huh? I mean, it's the year 1800. New century, new me. That's what they say, right? So let's pack it up. On y va. We gotta clap some Austrian cheeks. Again. Napoleon brought an entourage of 40,000 men across the Alps in 6 days. And then his troops delivered a cheek clapping of such ferocity that the Austrians signed a peace treaty which gave Napoleon even more territory and basically made him Don Europe Napoleon, first of his name, Clapper Supreme. That was his official title. You can Google that. So, recap, in 1792, Napoleon was made captain, and this was France's territory then. And this was France now in 1803 after Napoleon clapped cheeks and took names all over Europe. And this was a problem for the British because they didn't sign up for this guy taking over all of Europe. They wanted the chill French inbred Louis monarchs back that were like them, and they were so done with the République. So they declared war on France in 1803, and Don Europe just said, challenge accepté. And Napoleon went on to invade Britain, and obviously the only way to do that is over water, since, that's how islands work. But the British Navy was strong, too strong. Napoleon might have been undefeated on land, but in the water, he was a fish out of water. No, that doesn't work. In the water, Napoleon was like us black guys, out of his element. He lost big time at this sea battle against the British that became known as the Battle of Trafalgar. But that was okay, because when Napoleon returned to Paris, he was still able to spin the story and make it all about him being undefeated on European land. So Napoleon returned to France, whose territory was bigger than ever. Now, it was only right that he would drop the charade of France being ruled by 3 consuls and just made it official, took the stage, and told all of France,
I'm the captain now.
Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of France on December 2nd, 1804. literally crowned himself. I mean, the Pope was there and was going to put the crown on Napoleon's head, but Napoleon took that thing from him and was like, get out of here. I'm going to crown myself Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. Dawn Europe, first of his name, Clapper Supreme. At 35, he was the Emperor of France. No pressure, but I'm turning 34 next year. Even though he was the emperor now, Napoleon was not one to sit idle and get fat. Nah, man, they didn't call him God of War for nothing. Exactly 1 year after his coronation, Napoleon went back on another war campaign. This time he took his wife Josephine with him because now that he's emperor, he can't have her messing around. Plus, she didn't exactly have any civil rights anymore, so it's not like she could complain or refuse. Napoleon left for yet another battle. And if this was a movie, I call this bad writing, but I'm serious. He fought against the Austrians. Again. Once again, the Austrians did the ancient equivalent of calling your brothers for backup. They asked around the monarch fraternity, and this time Russia answered their call and agreed to be their backup. But you already know how this one ends. The Austrians facing Napoleon is like Team Rocket trying to stunt on Ash. Napoleon sent them packing at the famed Battle of Austerlitz, where he abandoned a strategically advantageous war position on purpose to bait the enemy into an attack, only to counterattack them with speed, divide the enemy forces, and defeat them to take even more land from them. Classic Napoleon. This guy could not be stopped. And to summarize Napoleon's battle with the Austrian Empire, Austria got whooped by Napoleon in Italy in 2 weeks. Then he crossed the Alps in 6 days to whoop them again. Then they pulled the I'm getting my big brother's card and still got whooped. That is why to this day we still call all Austrians the sons of Napoleon. So now that he dispelled all doubts about who Austria's daddy is, Emperor Dawn Europe Napoleon, first of his name Clapper of Cheeks, father of Austria, figured it was time to really lay his meat on the table and make Europe his once and for all. It was time to conquer Russia. Before he took his troops to Russia, Napoleon returned to Paris and cashed in on his cheating freebie. He had a baby with Éléonore Denuel de la Plaine, and I'm not just telling you that for no reason, because him and Josephine had been trying to have a baby for years, and Napoleon thought that maybe his little general was firing blanks, but now that Napoleon knew he was able to produce offspring just fine, and it wasn't him, but it was Josephine, he divorced Josephine. Supposedly, they separated in love, knowing it was important for the emperor to have an official male heir within the sanctity of marriage. So Josephine was out, and Napoleon married Marie-Louise, the daughter of, wait for it, the daughter of the Emperor of Austria. when I tell you, Napoleon took everything Austria had to offer. So, to celebrate this new marriage and show his love to his new wife, Napoleon decided it was time for a honeymoon in Russia without his wife. Also not a honeymoon at all, but a war campaign without his wife in Russia. Napoleon left for the Russian War. In 1812, Napoleon took his biggest army yet into Russia, 650,000 men assembled from all his territories. Taking over Russia would complete his conquest of Europe, except for the British, but we don't care about islands because we don't like water around here. This was going to be the end game, and 650,000 men marched into Russia. Less than 100,000 returned. Russia was a complete disaster for Napoleon. The Russians had learned that when Napoleon wants to fight, you don't fight. They knew his advantage was speed, so they just ran away from him and scorched the earth to slow his army down on their trek through Russia. This took away Napoleon's speed, and the battles he fought against the Russians on his way to Moscow were dragged out fights against an army that was retreating into safety while Napoleon's army was following them, living off of scorched earth, starving, exhausted, and decimated by the time they reached Moscow. With only 130,000 men, Napoleon marched into Moscow, and then the Russians basically just abandoned the city and burned it. Napoleon found nothing of value here, but he was convinced that the Russians would now come and fight for their prized city, and that he could defeat them in the battle in Moscow, but they didn't. They didn't fight. They just left him waiting in Russia, waiting for a fight that never came, but what did come was the Russian winter. And Napoleon was stuck in a burned down Moscow, with his road back home being equally burned down, scorched earth. He was trapped. This was a real problem. Winter in Russia was cold as hell and unforgiving, and the road home had nothing to give of value. Napoleon had made a major tactical error and had to retreat in a hurry if he wanted any of his troops to survive. And the Russians knew that. So on his retreat, they attacked the French troops here and there, and things got so bad that Napoleon eventually carried poison with him, ready to end his life rather than being captured. But in the end, he survived, and he returned home, as I said, with less than 100,000 men. But still, his army was beaten and broken for the first time. But the first time was all the European monarch fraternity needed. They kicked Napoleon while he was down, obviously, and in the Battle of Leipzig that followed, Napoleon gathered up the rest of his army and allies, making it close to 200,000 men that were fighting against the 300,000 men on the side of the Austrian, Prussian, Russian, and Swedish allied troops. The Battle of Nations in Leipzig, 500,000 people going at it. All those who had previously been beaten by Napoleon were out to finally defeat their now wounded nemesis. And they did. The clapper had become the clappee. Emperor Don Europe, Napoleon, first of his name, Supreme Clapper, father of Austria, was no more. His own country turned on Napoleon, and he was forced to abdicate. That's a fancy word for saying he had to give up the throne, by the way. I remember when I was a kid, I had to look that word up, and I hated it. Napoleon was sent into exile on the island of Elba, and that was the end of Napoleon's reign. Except that after 10 months of exile, Napoleon was like, nah, fam, let me single-handedly conquer France and become emperor again. And he did that. Back in France, Louis, the inbred number 18, was in charge, and life was back to being what it was like before the revolution ever took place. France was kind of a monarchy again, and the rest of the European monarchies were happy. So imagine everyone's face when they heard Napoleon escaped his exile and was back in Paris, like, surprise, bitches. Big Daddy Bonaparte was back, and this time he was the rebel. And this is like, what, the third rebellion in France now over the last 20 years? Whatever. Napoleon marched his little rebel army through France, and King Louis was confident he could end Napoleon's rebellion before it ever really starts. So Louis XVIII sent the royal army to confront Napoleon with bad intentions, and confront Napoleon with bad intentions they did. But my guy just stood there, and Napoleon was like,
Who's gonna do it then? Who's gonna kill me?
when I tell you he literally convinced them all on the spot to defect from the royal army and join his now growing rebel army, fam, bruv, Napoleon took back the throne without firing a single shot. The people were on his side, the army was on his side, and soon Napoleon's rebellion grew so big that there were no royal supporters left, and the inbred king number 18 had to flee the country. Napoleon was back in charge of France, and the rest of Europe was just like, are you fucking kidding me? We just exiled this guy. Fuck, yeah, he's back. Start up the propaganda machine, make him even shorter. So the European monarch fraternity got back together, and this time, they didn't even declare war on France. No. This time, they specifically declared war against Napoleon Bonaparte, a bunch of monarchies teaming up and specifically declaring war against the one man that threatened everything they stood for. That's gangster, man. You know, I'm a Napoleon, that's gangster. Hell, even the French monarch Louis XVIII joined the monarch fraternity and declared war on Napoleon and joined the fight. You know, but in a kind of useless way, kind of like Batman when Superman and Wonder Woman fought Doomsday. So it all had to end in a battle for the future of Europe, and that battle was at Waterloo. June 18th, 1815, 72,000 French under the command of Napoleon Bonaparte fought against the British, Dutch, Belgian, and German allied forces, 68,000 men under the command of the Duke of Wellington, with support of 45,000 Prussians. A battle that's really worth its own video. But the gist is that Napoleon's army wasn't much of an army anymore. They were young, inexperienced conscripts. He had no cavalry to execute his trademark high-speed warfare. Napoleon was once again LeBron James dragging a crappy team into battle, except this time he was not prime LeBron, he was old man LeBron. And in the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon made tactical mistakes. This 45-year-old Bonaparte, who had overcome exile and retook his country, was exhausted and finally beaten by his enemies for good. Napoleon lost at Waterloo. After 100 days back in power, Napoleon had to give up the throne again, this time for good, and he was exiled to St. Helena. And when I say exiled, I mean exiled for real this time. St. Helena is here. Bro, they were so done with Napoleon, they exiled him to the end of the world and had ships patrolling the island to make sure Napoleon never escapes again. And Bonaparte lived out the rest of his life on the island until he died at the age of 51 in 1821, and his supposed last words were, "To die is nothing, but to live defeated and without glory is to die every day." That's a bit dramatic, but it sounds cool. Yeah, I get it. And that's the end of the video, guys. If you're new to this channel, I have a lot of mythology videos. Greek mythology, Norse mythology. Now I'm doing this Napoleon video, and I'm gonna cover some more conquerors, so make sure you subscribe, ring that bell, you know how it goes, leave a comment, engage in conversation, show some love. And I'll be uploading once a week now because the workload has been out of this world, but I'll be doing once a week so I can continue to bring you quality videos every week. And the next video in the series on the conquerors will be